Zara and Bilal had endured grief the kind that gnaws at the soul, a silent, relentless ache that left their home hollow and every corner echoing with memory. The loss of their unborn child had changed everything. Their voices sounded too loud in the empty rooms, the floors creaked in protest under every step, and the air seemed to pulse with a quiet, almost sentient watchfulness. They had tried to move on, to fill the void with small gestures, but the silence pressed in, wrapping around them like a suffocating shroud. Every night, Zara would wake to the soft, imperceptible creak of floorboards, to shadows that twisted unnaturally across the walls, to the faint, metallic tang of something unplaceable in the air. She told herself it was stress, the residue of grief, her imagination painting the mundane in terrifying colors, but even Bilal had begun to notice it, the almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere, the feeling of being observed when no one was there. After months of mourning and quiet desperation, they had decided to adopt, hoping to reclaim the laughter, hope, and warmth that had been ripped from their lives. When Natasha arrived on a rainy evening, wrapped in a faded blanket, she seemed fragile in the literal sense of the word, yet in her gaze there was a depth Zara could not comprehend, a calmness that felt ancient and knowing. The child's eyes did not simply see, they pierced, scanning the room and somehow, reading the secrets of the walls, the floors, the couple's hearts. Zara shivered as she lifted the small bundle into her arms, sensing, almost immediately, that this was no ordinary child. The house itself seemed to respond to her presence, subtle shifts in shadow and draft alerting her that some dormant force had awakened. That night, as rain beat against the roof and wind rattled the windows, whispers filled the air, curling through the rooms in voices that were neither male nor female, young nor old, but something other, something deliberate. Natasha's gaze, luminous even in the dim moonlight, remained fixed on Zara, unwavering and unsettling. As Zara tried to sleep, she felt a subtle weight pressing on her chest, like the house itself had taken notice, watching, waiting, breathing. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams so vivid that they seemed more memory than imagination, children running through fog-choked forests, faceless figures whispering names she had never heard, dark shapes pressing in from all sides, and a presence she could not name that felt both cruel and patient. When she awoke, drenched in sweat and clutching the blankets, the room was empty, yet nothing felt the same. Objects had shifted subtly, a chair slightly angled, a window ajar when it had been closed, a faint trail of dust marking a path that no one had walked. Natasha slept soundly in her crib, serene and utterly calm, but the weight of her gaze lingered in the room as if she had never really closed her eyes. Days passed and the disturbances multiplied in subtle but unnerving ways. Cold drafts brushed Zara's cheeks when no window was open, shadows lengthened unnaturally along walls, and the faint sound of whispering followed her from room to room. Bilal tried to rationalize it. Old house, stress, grief. But even he began to notice the creaking of floorboards without footsteps, the inexplicable rearrangement of furniture, and fleeting glimpses of shapes at the edge of his vision that vanished when he looked directly. One evening, while tucking Natasha into bed, Zara discovered a scrap of paper tucked beneath the mattress, covered in angular, twisting symbols that seemed almost alive, curling and writhing under her gaze. Natasha merely smiled faintly and whispered words Zara could not understand, words that carried weight, purpose, and something older than the house itself. That night, the dreams returned, more intense and sinister. She wandered through impossibly long hallways, walls blackened with shadows, hearing a voice that was at once distant and intimate, naming her deepest fears, her hidden regrets, the sins of her ancestors she did not know she carried. When Zara woke, her heart pounding, the scrap of paper had vanished, leaving only a lingering sense of unease. Something had arrived with Natasha, something patient, ancient, intelligent, and hungry. It did not merely want the child. It wanted the parents' fear, grief, and despair, feeding off them, growing stronger with each quiet, desperate heartbeat. And in that moment, Zara understood with terrifying clarity that their lives, their home, and their hearts had been irrevocably altered. The whispers, the shadows, the drafty corridors, they were all signs of a darkness that had patiently waited, and now that it had been invited in, it would never leave. The rain continued to lash against the windows, But Zara could not shake the sense that the true storm had already begun inside the house, in the shadows, in the child, and in themselves. In the days that followed, Natasha's behavior became increasingly disturbing. She spoke in voices that were not hers, high-pitched yet commanding, soft yet urgent, sometimes reciting names and events Zara could not have known. Her drawings grew more sinister, faceless figures trapped in endless corridors, twisting, morphing symbols, and landscapes covered in fog. The diary appeared suddenly, lying on her desk with no memory of its arrival, filled with cryptic warnings and events that seemed to blur past, present, and future. The house itself responded. Shadows stretched unnaturally, objects moved without explanation, and the faint metallic tang returned, stronger, filling every room. Zara and Bilal's arguments grew frequent and bitter, fueled by exhaustion, fear, and the creeping realization that Natasha's presence had awakened something intelligent, ancient, and malevolent. Even at school, Natasha spoke of entities no one else could see, mentioning children who had lived and died long before her time. Each night, the whispers returned, reciting names, locations, and warnings of events yet to come. Zara's dreams became more vivid, almost prophetic, the child running through corridors of mist, following unseen figures, her own hands stained with the shadow's influence. She would wake drenched in sweat, heart racing, convinced she had witnessed events she could not fully comprehend. One evening, Natasha wandered into the attic, a place both Zara and Bilal had avoided since moving in. Inside, she pointed to a set of symbols etched into the beams, symbols identical to those in her drawings and in the mysterious diary. Her small finger traced the lines with deliberate precision, and the air seemed to thrum, alive with unspoken intent. Objects quivered in place, the lights flickered, and a soft, almost imperceptible chant hummed through the walls. Zara realized that Natasha was not merely haunted, she was a conduit, a vessel for a force that had been waiting centuries for an opportunity. The realization sent chills down her spine. The house, the child, and the family itself had become part of a cycle far older than memory, one that thrived on grief, despair, and fear. Each whispered warning, each subtle movement of objects, each cryptic symbol became evidence of a deliberate intelligence operating beyond human understanding. By the end of the week, the tension had reached a crescendo. Natasha's eyes would glow faintly in the dark, shadows twisted unnaturally around her, and the house seemed to pulse in time with her breathing. Bilal, once skeptical, now acknowledged the terrifying reality. Something had come into their home, something patient, cunning, and unstoppable, and it was only growing stronger with each heartbeat. The family's fragile sense of safety evaporated, replaced by the knowledge that they were no longer in control, that the child they had hoped would heal them might instead be the instrument of their undoing. Determined to uncover the truth, Zara investigated Natasha's origins. She discovered the orphanage she had come from, a decrepit, abandoned building hidden among misty hills, long rumored to be cursed. Locals whispered about children disappearing, families ruined, and the strange woman who ran it, a figure said to dabble in dark rituals. Inside, she found scattered diaries and records, detailing tragedies of children who had been sent there over decades, each ending in despair, death, or madness. Symbols identical to those Natasha drew were etched into walls, floors, and ceilings. The orphanage's history revealed a ritualistic obsession with an entity called Siyaah, a darkness that consumed grief and fear, using children as conduits to manifest in the physical world. Each diary contained accounts of children's dreams, possessions, and unexplained knowledge of events and people they could not possibly have known. Zara realized the entity had chosen Natasha deliberately, grooming her to become a vessel through which it could act in the world. The house at home, she understood, was responding to the child because it had already been imbued with the same malignant energy. Shadows writhed like living things, objects floated briefly in the air, and whispers filled empty rooms with names and threats. Every moment of fear Zara or Bilal experienced seemed to fuel the entity's power, and the realization struck with horrifying clarity. Their attempt to heal their family had instead invited an ancient, intelligent, and malevolent force into their lives. The whispers often mentioned names of ancestors, revealing sins long forgotten, betrayals, and cruelties that had bound the entity not only to the child but to Zara's lineage itself. Each night, the darkness grew bolder, and Natasha's calm demeanor became increasingly unsettling. She would smile faintly while shadows crept along walls, as if aware of them in a way that humans could not comprehend. Zara could feel the history of grief, death, and malevolence folding into her own home, merging with the living present, and she understood the terrifying truth. The cycle was already underway, and it had chosen her family as its next victims. Natasha's presence became an ever-escalating source of terror, her behavior both eerily calm and disturbingly deliberate. She no longer merely whispered to empty corners. She spoke in multiple voices, high-pitched and urgent, low and commanding, sometimes echoing names of people long dead or events Zara and Bilal could not possibly have known. Shadows no longer behaved naturally. They stretched across walls, lingered in corners, and occasionally seemed to recoil when Zara approached, as if aware of her attention. Objects moved with intent, a chair sliding slowly across the floor when no one was near, a cupboard door creaking open to reveal nothing, toys gathering in impossible formations on the living room rug. The diary grew thicker, pages filled with meticulous handwriting that shifted and changed whenever Zara tried to copy or photograph it. Symbols on the pages glowed faintly in dim light, pulsating as if breathing. One night, Natasha wandered into the attic unaccompanied. Zara and Bilal followed cautiously, only to find the child standing in a circle of arcane symbols etched into the wooden floor, her small hands tracing lines that seemed to thrum with power. The air was thick, vibrating with energy Zara could feel in her bones, and she realized the child was no longer merely passive. She was actively summoning or channeling something beyond comprehension. In that moment, the house itself seemed to react. The walls shivered, a low hum echoed from the floorboards, and a faint, almost imperceptible chanting reverberated through the air. It was then that Zara noticed the faint trail of scratches along the beams above Natasha's head, symbols identical to those in the orphanage records, twisting and writhing as though alive. Panic gripped her chest, but she could not stop watching as Natasha, with calm precision, moved her hands over the symbols. At that moment, the shadows coalesced into shapes, faceless, formless, yet menacingly present, stretching along walls and ceiling, reaching toward them as if drawn by the child's silent command. Bilal tried to intervene, his voice rising, but Natasha turned to him, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark, and whispered in a voice that was not hers. "Do not touch me. They are here." The temperature dropped suddenly. Breath formed mist in the air. Objects lifted and fell around them like marionettes caught in a storm. Zara's heart pounded as she realized the child was no longer just a conduit. She had become the epicenter of a force that was intelligent, aware, and malevolent. The attic seemed to expand impossibly, walls stretching into corners that defied geometry, the ceiling soaring higher than reason allowed. They felt trapped in a space that was no longer constrained by the physical world. Zara reached for Natasha, but the child pulled back, shaking her head with a small, terrifying smile. The whispers became a chorus, recounting sins, failures, and betrayals from generations past, echoing in their ears. The couple realized that the darkness was not only in Natasha, it was entwined with the very structure of their home, their history, and their minds. Every fear, every memory of grief and despair, became fuel, and the house pulsed with an unholy life. That night, Zara and Bilal understood with a horrifying clarity that their child, their hope for healing, had become a beacon for an intelligence older than memory, a force that had patiently waited centuries for a conduit, a host, and now, it had chosen them. The house, once their sanctuary, had become a labyrinth of malevolent design, and they were caught in the center, powerless, terrified, and irrevocably changed. Desperation drove Zara to seek out Khazar, a reclusive occult expert known for dealing with forces that defied explanation. His home, a small, cluttered space filled with ancient texts, candles, and talismans, smelled faintly of incense and something indefinably metallic. He listened carefully as Zara recounted the events, the whispers, the shadows, Natasha's drawings and multiple voices, the floating objects, the symbols, the attic, and the unbearable sense of being watched. Khazar's face, lined with age and tension, paled slightly as he examined the scrap of paper she had retrieved from Natasha's crib and the diary the child seemed to manipulate at will. He explained that the child was a conduit, a vessel for an entity known as Siyaah, a darkness that existed beyond human perception and fed on grief, fear, and ancestral sins. Khazar detailed the history of the orphanage, the rituals performed there, and the pattern of children carefully selected to host Siyaah. He warned that the entity was patient and intelligent, capable of manipulating reality to ensnare its victims and achieve its own incomprehensible purposes. Zara listened, horrified, as Khazar outlined the consequences. Failure to act would result not only in the child's possession but in the corruption of the family itself, the entity spreading its influence beyond the home. He instructed them on protective rituals, how to confront Siyaah without succumbing to fear, and the critical importance of acknowledging ancestral sins that bound the darkness to them. Returning home that night, Zara and Bilal sensed the air was charged, thick with intent. Natasha's behavior escalated further. She began speaking in tongues, her voice alternating between a child's innocence and something ancient and commanding, warning them of events yet to unfold. Objects levitated violently, the walls themselves seemed to breathe, and shadows twisted in unnatural formations. Khazar's instructions felt simultaneously urgent and insufficient, for the house itself had become an active participant in the entity's malevolent design. The couple realized that confronting Siyaah would not merely be a battle of wills, it would be a war fought across multiple planes of reality, testing the limits of their courage, intellect, and emotional endurance. That night, Natasha vanished from her crib, leaving only a faint glow in the attic as if the house itself had swallowed her. The air was electric, the faint hum of chanting echoing from nowhere and everywhere at once. Zara's hands trembled as she clutched the diary, feeling the pulsing symbols under her fingertips, almost as if they were alive. She whispered pleas for protection, for intervention, for a way to reclaim their child, but even her prayers seemed swallowed by the darkness. Shadows gathered at the corners of the room, coalescing into shapes that twisted and writhed with unnatural intelligence. She realized with terror that Siyaah had moved beyond simple possession. It had merged with the house, the child, and their own fears, creating a living labyrinth of malevolence from which there might be no escape. Every heartbeat, every whisper, every flicker of light was a reminder. The battle had begun, and the entity was far more powerful than they had imagined. The night of the storm arrived with a ferocity that seemed almost orchestrated by the darkness itself. Rain battered the windows with relentless rhythm, wind shrieked through the trees, and the house groaned as if alive. Natasha disappeared again, this time into the basement, a place that had never felt welcoming, now transformed into a labyrinth of twisting corridors and shifting walls. Zara and Bilal followed cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating impossibly long hallways that stretched and bent as if reality itself had been distorted. Shadows twisted and writhed, forming shapes that seemed to stalk them, moving independently of any light source. The air was thick, charged with energy, making every breath a struggle. Natasha's voice echoed from the depths, alternating between her childlike tone and something ancient, commanding, and unmistakably malicious. "They are coming! They are here!" Objects flew across the basement with violent intent, chairs, picture frames, and even heavy furniture suspended briefly before crashing with bone-shaking force. The walls pulsed as if alive, and whispers filled the air, recounting betrayals, sins, and names Zara and Bilal did not recognize but felt deeply in their bones. They came upon Natasha standing in the center of a massive circle of glowing symbols etched into the floor, her small hands raised as the shadows gathered around her, coalescing into towering faceless figures. The child's eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and Zara realized that Natasha was no longer merely a conduit. She was fully inhabited, a vessel through which Siyaah manifested. The house seemed to fight them, corridors twisting to trap them, walls bending impossibly to prevent escape. Their screams echoed unheard. The storm outside seemed distant, irrelevant compared to the maelstrom of supernatural chaos surrounding them. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet they knew the only way to save Natasha was to confront the darkness directly. Khazar's instructions replayed in Zara's mind: acknowledge ancestral sins, confront the entity without fear, and use the power of love and determination to reclaim the child. Summoning courage she did not know she possessed, Zara began to recite the ritual aloud, naming betrayals and sins, her voice steady despite the chaos. Shadows shrieked, swirling violently as the symbols on the floor pulsed in response. Natasha screamed, torn between the darkness and her own innocence. Objects collided, ceilings groaned, and the walls themselves seemed to fold inwards. Then, a blinding light erupted from Zara's outstretched hands, illuminating the basement in white brilliance. Silence followed, deafening and unnatural. Natasha collapsed, unconscious but unharmed, and the shadows dissipated, leaving behind only trembling walls and a lingering, electric unease. The battle had not ended, they realized. It had only paused, the entity retreating for now, biding its time. Weeks of fragile calm followed, but Zara and Bilal understood this was temporary. Natasha appeared normal on the surface, playful, joyful, and innocent, yet fleeting shadows lingered at the edges of rooms, whispering her name and their deepest fears. Objects occasionally shifted inexplicably, and the diary's pages would turn on their own, glowing faintly in the dark. Zara investigated further, uncovering records of other children from the orphanage. Each had faced sudden disappearances, mental collapse, or violent deaths. It became clear that Siyaah's influence was not confined to the house. It existed wherever grief and fear intersected, and its patience was infinite. Even relocation would not guarantee safety. Natasha occasionally muttered phrases that were not her own, recounting events from decades prior or speaking in languages the couple did not know. Shadows pooled near her, bending reality around their edges, as if testing boundaries, probing weakness. The couple understood the fight for Natasha's soul was ongoing, a slow, invisible war that would require constant vigilance, unwavering courage, and a willingness to confront both ancient evil and the darkest corners of their own minds. Nights were worse, dreams returned, more vivid and prophetic than ever, mixing past atrocities from the orphanage with distorted visions of what might come. The house seemed to have memory, recording events, replaying whispers, and feeding off fear. Zara realized the entity's intelligence extended beyond simple malevolence. It was calculating, manipulative, and patient, capable of waiting for years, decades, or generations for the opportune moment to strike. The couple grew isolated, fearful of friends or family discovering the extent of their torment, yet desperate to maintain the semblance of normal life. Each day, the whispers intensified, testing their resilience. The diary's pages now frequently bore new symbols, glowing faintly, as though Siyaah was observing, responding, and learning. The darkness was patient, intelligent, and eternal, and the couple understood with chilling clarity that Natasha's innocence was a fragile veil over an abyss waiting to consume everything they loved. A year later, the couple attempted to restore some sense of normalcy. Natasha attended school, played with other children, and appeared ordinary to the outside world. Yet Zara knew better. The house itself seemed alive, watching, reacting to every action. The shadows occasionally moved independently, and the whispering persisted, though quieter. One evening, while cleaning the attic, Zara discovered a hidden collection of letters and records from the orphanage. They described rituals, children trained as vessels, and patterns of tragedy that spanned generations. Each page revealed that the entity was not random but deliberate, selecting hosts to manipulate events across decades. Natasha had been carefully groomed, chosen for her resilience and intelligence. Zara realized the cycle was not broken, it had merely been delayed. The entity was patient, waiting for weakness, grief, or fear to resurface, and it could act through any conduit. The walls themselves seemed to murmur, replaying the events of the stormy night when the entity had been forced back, as if remembering, learning, and preparing. Natasha sometimes murmured phrases in her sleep, warnings, prophecies, or commands, sometimes perfectly lucid, sometimes guttural and alien. Zara understood that Siyaah's intelligence extended beyond the physical, capable of influencing perception, dreams, and even the passage of time. She realized that while they had survived, the darkness remained, dormant but vigilant, waiting for the precise moment to strike again. It was a patient predator, eternal, cunning, and bound to the child in ways they had only begun to comprehend. Attempts to relocate proved futile. Shadows seemed to follow Natasha, whispering her name, and objects occasionally moved as if the entity had never left. Friends and neighbors noticed her uncanny knowledge, the child's ability to predict events, and her unsettling calm in the presence of danger. Zara and Bilal understood that Siyaah was no longer confined, it could exist wherever Natasha went. One night, Natasha awoke screaming, speaking in multiple voices, recounting the deaths of children from the orphanage and repeating ancient chants. Shadows coalesced into shapes behind her, faceless, towering, intelligent. The couple realized that their child's innocence was a veneer, a fragile barrier over a force far older and more powerful than anything they had faced. The whispers were now instructions, warnings, and taunts, echoing through the house and the family's minds. Even Khazar could not guarantee permanent safety. The entity's patience and intelligence were beyond any ritual. Zara understood the grim truth. Survival meant vigilance, strength, and constant confrontation with both the entity and their own fears. Siyaah's cycle was eternal, bound not just to Natasha but to the grief, fear, and sins of those around her, feeding, learning, and waiting for the next opportunity to manifest fully. The family's normalcy was fragile, ephemeral, and constantly under threat from a darkness that had mastered patience and cunning over centuries. Years later, the family settled in a distant town, hoping distance would bring peace. Natasha appeared ordinary, joyful, playful, innocent. Yet the house they left behind retained the marks of Siyaah's presence, the shadows lingering, the symbols glowing faintly in empty corners. On the night of a new moon, Zara awoke to scratching at the bedroom door, soft but deliberate. Natasha whispered from her bed, "I remember." The diary had appeared again, pages flipping open by themselves, symbols glowing in the moonlight. Shadows pooled behind the child, forming the faceless shape of Siyaah, and for a moment, Zara felt time itself bend, reality twist, and the air thicken with malevolence. Natasha's innocent smile masked centuries of intelligence, patience, and hunger. The whispers returned, echoing through the room, recounting sins, failures, and betrayals across generations. Zara and Bilal understood the final truth. They had survived the first wave, but the darkness was eternal, patient, and unstoppable. The cycle continued, feeding on grief, fear, and despair, waiting for the next opportunity to manifest fully. Natasha, the child who carried darkness, had become the nexus of an intelligence older than time itself, and nothing would ever be the same again. As the whispers faded into a chilling silence, Zara realized that Siyaah's presence was no longer bound by space or time. It existed wherever the child was, patient, eternal, and waiting for the next heartbeat of fear to awaken it once more. The camera of imagination pans outward, through shadows and empty streets, across misty landscapes, over abandoned orphanages, all whispering a single chilling truth: soon,